Hi, this is Jeremy Jansen, and I'd like to welcome you to the final Reason Wizardry issue of 2010. For this issue, we're going to go back old school and check out one of the most unique and still very useful devices in the Reason rack, and that, of course, is Malstrom. This topic in particular was requested by one of the Reason Wizardry subscribers, and I was able to fit it in for this month's topic. So I'd like to reiterate, if you have an idea for a future Reason Wizardry issue, don't hesitate to send me an email, because it's actually quite common that I get a chance to use these ideas for issues. So what we're going to look at in particular with Malstrom this month is what makes Malstrom unique, what makes it still useful even if you have Thor and perhaps some VST synths that are powerful as well, how you can quickly come up with some basic synthesized sounds using Malstrom, and how you can create some similar sounds using different, more non-standard techniques. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do this month is give a relatively quick general overview of Malstrom and its functions. So Malstrom is a graintable synthesizer. I've described that in the past, and I'll quickly do that again. Basically, a graintable could also be called a wavetable. It's actually very similar to the Thor wavetable oscillator. So what both the Malstrom and the wavetable oscillator have is a series of single cycle waveforms stacked in a row. And that's what this index control is for, and the same thing with the position control right here. But what happens is when you play all these single cycle waveforms in a series, they can encompass a larger sound, such as an acoustic guitar or a thunder sound. So in a way, what you could do is think of Malstrom as a really supercharged version of Thor's wavetable oscillator. There's many more options in Malstrom for modulating how the graintable works than we've got in Thor here. And we've also got many more and much more varied graintables in comparison to the relatively few wavetables on offer in Thor. So I'm going to just illustrate for you how this sounds when each sound is made up of many single cycles using this thunder waveform. So if I just play a single note, okay, so that's what you'd expect. But what if I reduce motion to negative 127? What you're hearing there is the first grain in the graintable. So the index parameter controls which grain is the starting grain. So you can actually hear the entire thunder sound if I manually move this index while motion is all the way to the left. So that's exactly what motion is doing. It's just modulating the index. And it's important to note that different graintables are modulated differently. So some of them are going to loop. So in essence, they're going to go back and forth and back and forth. Some of them just reach the end and stop. And some of them, I believe, loop a smaller portion of the end of the waveform. So we don't have any control over that directly. When you use the motion parameter, you get whatever motion is built into that graintable, which was programmed by the propeller heads. Let's try that with one more graintable, something a little bit more melodic. Let's try the chime. So you can hear that one. I'm just holding down one key. So this thing, this grain table rather, is reaching the end and then looping right back to the beginning. Okay, and now if we turn motion all the way down, it will keep slowing down the speed of moving through the index until at its bottom range, it's actually going to stop moving through the index. And index 0 is actually silent in this case. And that's what index 1 sounds like. So that explanation should start you off on how grain table synthesis works. Next, I'm going to just briefly look at each part of the Malstrom synth. So starting over here, everything is pretty standard. Polyphony, legato, portamento work as you'd expect. Then we get the velocity stuff, and it's interesting because this is a fixed function synth. We don't have a lot of control over, say we want velocity to modulate motion. Well, we can't do that. What we have here is what we can use velocity to modulate. Those are the destinations that we've been given. So unless we send CV into Malstrom or use combinator modulations, this is what we are going to use. And one of the great things about Malstrom is just its quick ease of use. So when I use it, I tend not to get really crazy with bringing in outside CVs and whatnot. It's nice to just use what you've got available because you can see it all so easily on this small device window. So it's pretty standard stuff. One thing that's interesting is that you can use velocity to modulate attack, and that counts for A or B oscillators or both. So that's really useful when maybe you create a patch that if you have a lower velocity, when you hit a note, maybe it's going to have less of a sharp attack. It's going to sort of fade in or some variation on that. So that's a nice parameter to have and is sometimes overlooked in here. So as far as the mod wheel section here, beyond the ordinary, there's one thing to note with the mod wheel to modulator setting. It's not immediately apparent exactly what you get out of that. And basically what that does is control all, well, either A or mod B, all of the modulations that are attached to it. So say we were using the shift parameter here, and we turn this mod wheel to modulator all the way up, then we are going to have no modulation with no mod wheel and full modulation with full mod wheel. So that's what you might expect, but in addition, if we had other destinations, so pitch and index, say, it's going to control all of those. Not that there's anything really useful about that sound in particular, that just demonstrates how you can use this to control multiple LFO destinations with just a flick of your mod wheel. All right, so moving on, we've got the two modulators, and what I really like about these LFOs, which is what they essentially are, is that they've got some incredible waveforms, many of which don't exist in Thor. So that alone is something that keeps Malstrom very useful. So the next thing that's unique about the modulators in Malstrom is this one-shot mode. Effectively, with the one-shot mode, you can turn the modulators into envelopes. Now, I think I've discussed this in the past, but I'm going to quickly go through that again and show you how it works. So we'll just go back with our chime sound here, and you can hear it. And now I've chosen appropriate decaying modulator shape. And if I say apply some shift modulation, we're going to get essentially the same sound that we'd get if we had an envelope shaped about like that, routed to the shift parameter. Let's listen. The modulation doesn't happen again and again because one shot will just have the modulation occur once and then stop. And it's even cooler because, of course, you can sync the modulator, which we're using as an envelope, and have a specific length to your envelope. So we could have an 8th note decay. Or a 1-bar decay. This ability to use the modulators as envelopes is especially useful in Malstrom because the filter envelope is the only spare envelope you've got, and it isn't really easy to send that to any other parameter other than filter frequency. So if you want an enveloped sound to affect another destination, you're kind of stuck with the filter envelope unless you use this pseudo envelope or LFO one-shot technique, whatever you want to call it. All right, so next we've got the oscillators A and B. I've already discussed how Graintable works and what motion does and what the index parameter do. Next, we've got the shift knob. And what shift does is move the formant frequency of the sound. We'll just get rid of that modulation for a moment and move it manually. So it's still got the same pitch. It's not actually changing the pitch of the note. We can hear that well by, say I turn up the shift all the way, as opposed to turning the octave up all the way. It's a different effect. That maybe wasn't the best demonstration, but you can use some different grain tables and you'll hear that shift doesn't equal just a plain pitch shift. There's more to it than that, and that's great because it's a useful modulation that can affect the grain tables in really cool and interesting ways. So we've got the pitch controls that are pretty standard, and then we've got an ADSR envelope for each one of the oscillators. And finally, we've got a gain control for each oscillator, which is useful for balancing their gains before they go into the filter. So that's all pretty straightforward. Now we'll move on to the filters. In order to get audio in the filters, we've got to route it in using these different toggles. We can route the audio in 2 different ways from oscillator A, but only one way from oscillator B. And it's pretty self-explanatory. Oscillator B has to enter filter B, whereas oscillator A can start out in filter B or it can start out in the shaper. Now, once audio gets into filter B, say we use this control right here, it'll either go straight to the outputs, or with this toggle, we can send it into the shaper, which will then continue on to filter A and then the outputs. So there's a fair amount of configurability of the signal path when it comes to the oscillators being sent through the filters and the shaper. And what's really nice is how quick it is to change the signal path and try something different. It's not a matter of messing around in a mod matrix. You can just click a few toggles and decide whether you like your sound better that way or not. Okay, so as far as the filters, let's just get a more standard synth sound here. How about a 4 times, I guess a quad sawtooth sound? Okay, so we've got it sent through the low pass filter. So a few things to note here. The way the filter envelope affects the filters is a little bit different and non-standard. So if you want the envelope to affect the filter, you have to click that, and then the amount that the envelope is affecting the filter is controlled here. You can turn on keyboard tracking for the filter, which means that depending on which key you press, it's going to adjust the filter frequency, but you can't control how much keyboard tracking. So that's a little bit of a downside compared to Thor. It's an all or nothing. Either you want full keyboard tracking or none. But it also simplifies your options, so you can easily hear the difference between the two settings. Okay, so for the low pass 12 dB filter, personally, I don't like its sound that much, especially compared to Thor's newer filters. So if you're looking at creating a sound that really heavily relies on a low pass filter, I would probably create that in Thor. It's hard to really quantify exactly why that is, but just after using the two synths for some time, I don't find the low pass filter, when used with high resonance for, say, a sound like this maybe. I just don't find the sound of this low pass filter for kind of classic virtual analog type sounds very satisfying. And the bandpass filter kind of falls into the same category. So if I do end up using those filters in Malstrom, it's more to sculpt the sound, get rid of any harsh high end, or use two band passes in parallel to send two sets of frequencies to the output. More that sort of stuff than the traditional resonant filter type sounds. So next, it's pretty obvious that there isn't a 12 dB high pass filter. Why? I've never been sure of, but again, if you're needing a high pass filter, you're going to want to use Thor for your sounds. After that, we've got the two comb filters. And while I really like the comb filters in Thor, Malstrom is just as good, if not better. They're really quick to use, and since you can use two of them in series or parallel, you can create some great comb sounds really fast. Just as a bit of a refresher, the comb controls are a little bit different. Frequency controls the length of the delay. A comb filter is essentially a very fast delay, and the frequency knob controls that. So that's a very quick delay, and then a slower delay, you'll actually, you can kind of hear that. That's almost slow enough to be like a very quick slapback delay. And then the resonance knob controls the feedback on the delay. So that's why the decay of the sound is longer when the feedback is up. Because of course, if you have low feedback on your delay, it's going to just happen once and then stop. So as far as the different polarities of the comb filter, I'm not really privy to the exact technical details behind it. Generally, I just try both comb filters and see what sounds best. I do know that with the negative comb filter mode, often you'll lose some bass. So if you want to kind of keep the full range of whatever sound it is that you're creating, you're probably going to use the positive comb filter mode. And finally, we have the amplitude modulation mode, which I seem to remember I discussed very recently in Wizardry. But once again, it is a little bit different than resonance and frequency. Instead, we've got the mix of the amplitude modulation here, and then the frequency of the oscillator that is actually amplitude modulating your whatever oscillators you're running through it. So you can hear we have no mix if I turn this down. Okay, moving on. Next, we've got the shaper. I'll turn off our filter here and activate the shaper toggle. And we've got some different shapers here, and we'll listen to them. We've got the sine shaper. It's important to note that these shapers, even though they may have similar names to shapers that are in Thor or in the Scream 4 device, I haven't found the sounds that similar. So these algorithms are somewhat unique, even compared to other similar algorithms in Reason. I'll let you read in the manual exactly what these shapers do, but I'll give you kind of my take on which ones I find useful. I don't really care for the sound of the sine shaper. I think it's quite inferior to the same shaper that is available in Thor. The saturate shaper is not bad, but again, I would say it's somewhat inferior to the Thor shaper. Clipping is a little bit too dirty for my taste. I don't tend to use that one very much. Quantizing is like a bit crusher, and often it can sound really good. If you listen to me turn it up here, it sounds pretty good, but keep in mind that since you're bit crushing the audio, whatever enveloping you're doing to the sound is probably going to just disappear, because a sound with almost no bit depth is just going to be either on or off, essentially. So it doesn't matter if we have what kind of decay or attack shape we create. Pretty much we're getting rid of it and just putting kind of an on and off envelope on the sound by bit crushing it this much. And if we go back to the original sound, it's a smooth decay. Of course, it's much louder as well. And then noise mixes in a quickly decaying noise source. The noise shaper is a nice way to get some noise into the signal path if you didn't already maybe bring some noise in using an oscillator set to pink noise or resonant noise. I don't tend to use it that much myself. So that should cover it for an overview of Malstrom. Before I get on to creating some sounds, there's one more thing I want to show you, and that's a way to control exactly how you want Graintable to move through the index. So I said in the beginning that this motion control is the only way that you can scroll through the index, and it's preset to move through in a linear way and loop exactly how the propeller head set that up that they wanted it to loop. But actually there's another way to scroll through the index parameter without using any motion at all. And it's very effective, and you can get a lot more mileage out of the graintables by using it. So I'm going to show you that now, and how we do that And I'm going to demonstrate it with this 303 loop. I'm first going to play it just normally with motion set at 0 and index set at 0. So it's a full loop, and I always found that a little bit strange because it's not necessarily that useful in Malstrom. You could maybe pick out some little bits and pieces with maybe a quick decay. But for a full loop, it's not that useful, especially since you can't, if you could import your own loops, then you could process them with Malstrom, and that would be great. But this one particular 303 loop, I never found it that useful, but it's very useful for hearing the effect of a modulation on the index parameter, because we know how it's supposed to sound. It's got a set melody to it, and so you can tell if something is going wrong with it when you try to mimic the motion parameter using a different modulation. Well, you'll just hear what I mean. Basically, what we're going to do is turn down the motion to nothing. And we're back in that single cycle mode. So now there's no motion at all. But what we can do is modulate the index parameter using a modulator. And if we use the correct shape, this is a completely linear shape. What it's going to do is just scroll through the index parameters, and it's going to sound almost identical to using motion. Actually, I've chosen a slightly different shape here just because a forward ramp is actually more self-explanatory. So it's going to be, if you could just imagine, it's going to be going up through each one of the grains. And this is a positive modulation. So it's going to just move through in a linear way the index. So you can listen to it right now. And we can control the rate of it with the mod rate parameter. And of course, we can sync that up to MIDI clock. So this will be a 1-bar loop. And if we change our host tempo, it's at 128 right now. I'll just raise it. Now it's at 170. So that would be really great if we could import our own loops. We could basically time stretch them through Malstrom with a good quality Graintable algorithm like they've got. But beyond that, this is useful for creating your own shapes through the index with other waveforms. Say, moving back to the chime waveform. We actually had a situation with this waveform where the index was heading all the way to the end, and then it was looping back. I'll just turn this off and turn motion back on and hold down a key so you can hear. So I'm not sure why they set it to do that, but if I hold down a key, I don't really want it to replay the attack of the sound. This is a chime. I'd like it to just decay. So we can do that. We can set up whatever decay shape we want by turning down the motion and using the modulator. Well, let's leave sustain up just to test it out. Turn off sync. Well, that'll actually give us a reverse chime. And we want to turn on one-shot mode, so this just happens once. and a decay after that. So the only problem with this is we have an issue in that when the modulator completely modulates the index to the end, it totally stops. And when the grain table stops on an index, it's going to sound strange. You'll hear it right now. So it's just like a complete basic single cycle at the end of the chime. We can control how long the chime takes to happen, or the length of time it takes for the index to reach that final point using the rate parameter. But eventually it'll get there, and then it'll just sit there and sound unnatural. So you're going to want to tailor the decay time so that your sound volume decays by the time it reaches that final index. That's just a little bit long. And of course, you can change the rate as well. So by using this technique, you can control the grain table's journey through the index. You can reverse the grain table. You can add all sorts of variants to the index by using different modulators. And you can just add a whole bunch of spice to the grain tables that you may have used in the past and become somewhat bored with by turning their motion down and letting their index be controlled by a Malstrom modulator. Now I'm going to show you some sounds, and I'm going to start off with some fairly simple sounds that are really easy to create using Malstrom, because as I started out with, that's the main reason to use Malstrom, is how quick it is to use. So we're going to start out by creating some basses using Malstrom. And right to begin with, I can tell you that some of the bass grain tables sound great, and you don't need to do very much with them. One of my favorites is the chorus bass. Oh, I have a little bit of shaper on there. I really like the sound of that. Obviously, it's just mono, so you could add unison or chorus to that. So widen it. Or, of course, you could use the technique of doubling up the oscillators and detuning them. So we'll just add that quickly here. Get a little bit of detune. Send them both through different filters. And then use the spread amount to spread the two filters across the stereo spectrum. Of course, we'll want the same octave. So that's a great way to add some stereo depth to your patch. But of course, that's separating your two filters. So if you wanted a signal path that involved two serial filters, you can't do that because each oscillator needs to be independently sent to a different filter. And the shaper doesn't really work in this case because you can't send both filter B and A through a shaper. You can only send the output of filter B through the shaper. But if you're okay with that, that's a great way to add some stereo depth to the simple Malstrom sounds. I also really like pick bass. Not too partial to some of the other basses here, but of course your taste might be more in line with what they offer. So next, maybe you want to create something more electronic and filtered. And as I said, I prefer to use Thor for most filtered, especially envelope filtered sounds. But we can do some other stuff with it. So let's pull up, let's say the 16 times square sound. Actually, let's initialize this patch first. Okay, so there's the basis of our sound. Now let's add a sub oscillator below that. And in general, I don't find sub oscillators need that, fat detuning. So we can just go with a square instead of the 16 times and pitch it down an octave. Match up the envelopes here, or approximately anyway. Okay, so now to send them both through the same filter, and we'll try sending them through a comb filter, actually. With a high frequency and some moderate resonance, a comb filter for bass sounds actually kind of fattens the sound, whereas with a low frequency, it kind of, it's a little bit too much. It adds some flab to the sound that you probably don't want. But it's a nice subtle effect to have some high frequency comb filtering. So you can hear that. And we'll send that on through the shaper. And maybe add some saturation here. And then end it off with a little bit of a low pass filter just there to take the edge off the saturation. Okay, so that's a good start. Of course, there's much more you could do with this. Add some compression or whatever you like, a phaser. Change the polyphony, and you probably want it to be a legato bass. But that's a good start for a bass that I feel plays to some of Malstrom's strengths. All right, now we're going to create a couple pads with Malstrom. Pads are really easy with Malstrom because of the great grain tables that it starts out with. Some of my very favorites are the ambient chords. It's almost hard to create a bad patch when you're starting with something that good. But what I like it most for are vocal pads. And one of the reasons is, of course, just the wide variety of vocal patches vocal grain tables it comes with. We're going to start with Angel Choir and maybe change it to something after. So we'll start with Angel Choir. And let's get more of a pad envelope shape here. and raise our polyphony. All right, so it's pretty good on its own, but I'm going to use some filtering now to make it a little bit more interesting. I told you before that I generally don't do regular bandpass stuff with the bandpass filters, but as I said, it can be nice to use them as two different frequency splits when you use them in parallel. So I'll show you how that works. We're going to send this Angel Choir both to filter B and filter A separately in parallel. So to do that, we go like that and make sure that this toggle isn't set and switch them to bandpass. And we're going to use the spread knob here, and that's going to spread the outputs of the filters to opposite sides. And I don't want the patch to end up like that, but I do want to use it so that I can hear the filters on each ear, so it makes it easier to hear exactly what each filter is doing. So you can hear I'm adjusting the right ear there. So I'll pick a frequency here. And now we'll choose a different resonance and frequency for the other side. And then we can pan them back to the center with no spread. We can continue on and get a little bit of a slow modulation of both filters going. And whereas in Thor, we might have to do some mod matrix mechanics for that, we can easily just have the modulator be sent to both filter A and filter B, and then raise our filter frequency slightly. Choose a very slow rate, and then you can hear the results. You can hear the sound is pretty resonant, so personally I would add some compression onto this. So that's a really great sounding, easy to create vocal pad patch. And if you wanted variants on that theme, of course you could very easily just change the grain table and you'd get something quite different. Seems to actually work better with the breath voices, probably because there's so much high frequency content in this grain table. All right, I'll save that one for you. Now let's start from scratch and create a different pad using one of the ambient chord waveforms or grain tables that I mentioned before. That's a pretty complex sound. Personally, I'd like something more standard, kind of underneath it. So let's find a saw waveform here. I think I'll leave it on the root note. All right, so we've got a good start there. How about going with something, instead of heavily filtering it or trying something like that, why don't we just get kind of a gated sound to it by modulating the volume of both oscillators? Keep in mind that these modulators are polyphonic LFOs. So when I play those notes, if you don't play the notes on the beat, you're going to have volume changes that kind of beat against each other. It can be a little bit of a mess. So what's helpful instead is to use a monophonic LFO. And to do that, you can route any LFO from any device into Malstrom. In this case, I'm going to use something a little bit different, use a subtractor. So we'll just flip the rack around here and we'll send LFO1 out to the level. All right, now we just need to go in here and sync up this LFO, set its rate to 1/8. We can very easily adjust the amount of modulation we'd like. So we could go with that, but I'm also thinking of something a little bit more complex. So why don't we try instead to create a Thor and use its step sequencer to modulate the volume of this patch. So we'll send the step sequencer #1 curve out CV output 1 to the level control. And now we'll just draw in a curve here. How about, we'll say 8 steps. The nice thing about using Thor for this is that we can trigger it from a MIDI note so that every time we press a key, this, I guess you could call it a gate sequence, or this volume sequence is starting from exactly where we want, which is the first step. So it's very simple to do that. We just set up a MIDI key gate triggering the step sequencer. So that way we have a really predictable way to sequence up a gate that goes well with our pad patch. Let's add a delay line and see what this pad sounds like with a little bit of rhythmic delay. All right, so you could even take this farther if you wanted to. I can hear the next step that I would probably take. When you hold this pad down and then let go, you can see the gate stopping. So I'd probably try to figure out a way to fix that by maybe using an envelope to fade out this effect, this gating effect. But that's a little bit outside the scope for this month. All right, so there's 2 pads quite quickly and easily created with Malstrom. All right, so we've created some different bases and some different pads using Malstrom. Now I'm going to show you what I like to create most with Malstrom, and that's small arpeggiated notes, especially digital sounding. Works great with arpeggiate. So with that in mind, this patch has been partially created, so I'm going to just start showing you it and then kind of build upon it. So you can hear what it sounds like right now. It sounds great, and that's once again just courtesy of the really awesome Graintable behind it, which is the Additive Wave 2. So there's no filtering going on. We're not using the second oscillator right now. Just this one waveform. And if I move around through the index, you can hear a whole variety of different sounds that we could be getting. So what I'd like is something so that on every key press, we get a different index. So you can get a really ever-changing and evolving sound that'll sound great when it's run through the arpeggiate device. But it's not really straightforward how to get that done. And the first thing you might try is the modulator here. So if we set that to index, the problem is that it starts over with every note. It's sunk up to the start of every note, and it's polyphonic, so it's not the same modulation for multiple notes. So we could solve that by using an LFO from Thor or Subtractor and routing it in via CV. But that doesn't quite solve it either, because what I want is a modulation that happens when you press the key. So say index moves to here when we press the key, and it doesn't move again until you press the key again. Kind of like that. So I'm going to show you how to do that, and we need a Thor, and we're going to use its step sequencer once again. And so I'll show you what I've got set up here. We've got, we're using sequencer curve 1 again. We're sending it to CV output 1, and we're syncing up the MIDI gate to trigger the sequencer, just like before. So we're going to actually have to connect up this CV here. Modulation output going to the index parameter. So now we're connected, and now you'll be able to hear the effect. But you'll notice that what we've got is a randomization going on here. So I've set up, you know, a pretty much random 16 different steps. And then I've set us into step mode, which means that every time we press a key, the sequencer is advanced one step. Now, if we were in forward mode, you'd see what would happen. But if we switch to random, we're going to get a random CV value sent out every time we press a key. So let's hear what that sounds like. Switch the arpeggiator on. Get a little bit slower time values here. So you can add quite a bit of interest to sounds like this by evolving them randomly using Thor step sequencer in conjunction with Malstrom's index parameter. Of course, there's other waveforms or grain tables that you could use as well, and one in particular is a special one that I've mentioned before in Wizardry, and it's VS Waves. And it actually encompasses all the waveforms from the Prophet VS hardware synthesizer. So there's, I believe, 128 single cycle waves that aren't necessarily related at all to each other. So they're all completely separate, not really meant to be played back in series. So it works really well with something like this. Let's hear how it sounds. Part of the problem there is we still have some motion happening. So even though we have a short decay, every time we have a random CV value sent out to set the index somewhere, it's still moving forward slightly every time. And that sounds good with the last grain table we chose, but actually turning motion all the way down should just give us a different single cycle for every time we hit the key without kind of fading into the next waveforms in front of it or the next grains. So let's hear how that sounds. Of course, if you slightly adjusted this sequence, you'd get totally different waveforms because, like I said, there's 128 in here. So just based on the ones I've chosen, you're going to get a very small subset of that. So let's go back to the previous additive wave 2. And let's continue on from there, adding a little bit more motion to it. What if we added something very similar to the modulation we're doing on the index parameter, but this time on the shift parameter? So I've created another Thor that's virtually identical. You can see the mod matrix is basically the same. The sequence here is the same as well. And what we're going to do is connect that one, its CV1 output, up to the shift parameter. All right, so this is essentially going to be playing a different shift value for every note on. So let's hear how that sounds. I'm going to just lower us an octave here. We've actually got one small difference, and that's that we're not using a random sequencer here. We could switch it onto random and get a completely random shift for every note on. But I find it's a nice balance to use one randomized modulation and one kind of cycling modulation. One other kind of change you could add in is maybe go to a pendulum modulation. So that should get you started on creating some arpeggio patches using Malstrom. I've actually added a little bit more to this patch, and I'm going to show you how that works as well. I've got a second oscillator set up, and I've also got some filtering set up. It doesn't necessarily make the patch better. I think the patch sounds great the way that it is, but if you'd map some combinator rotaries and buttons to some of these other options, you could have a more flexible combinator that could encompass many different sounds instead of just the one that I've showed you so far. So let's hear what it sounds like if we add in this sawtooth waveform. Okay, now we've got some filtering as well. With some shaping, saturate shaping coming after that. And then a little bit of low pass filter at the end to shave off that harsh high end. So there you have it. Hope you like this arpeggiated patch. All right, so that brings us to the end of this Malstrom issue, the December 2010 issue of Reason Wizardry. I hope you enjoyed this retro look back at Malstrom, and I hope all of you have a really great Christmas and holiday. I'll be back in January, of course, with more Wizardry. So until then, best wishes to all of you. I'm Jeremy Jansen. Cheers.